panel is the department, so come join us. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Pete. Like, I appreciate you jumping in here and joining us on our symposium. Like I said, I've had that pleasure of getting a chance to work with you a lot. I'm sure the folks in the industry are going to get a chance to get to know you better too in the coming weeks and months. And I'm sure they're all looking forward to that. So thanks for joining us, Pete.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much, Tristan.
So next, before I exit here, I will hand it off to my colleague, Joanne Berman. Joanne's going to be moderating our next panel focused on leadership and governance in cybersecurity. Joanne joined DFS in 2020. You know, she's one of those colleagues that I met when she was interviewing for the job and then didn't meet again in person until 2021 because of the pandemic, despite the fact that we were together almost every day. Joanne came to DFS from the New Jersey Attorney General's office, where she focused on regulatory issues. And before that, she has extensive experience in private practice at several different law firms. You know, I think we're also tremendously fortunate to have Joanne as the counsel to the cybersecurity division. She takes point on the most challenging legal, regulatory, interpretive questions that we have at DFS, right? If it's a difficult question about our cybersecurity regulation, whether it comes from industry or whether it comes from within DFS, you can bet that Joanne is tackling it. And she has, during their time here, really mastered the intricacies and the nuances of our cybersecurity regulation. And I think, fair to say, I know a fair amount about our cyber reg too, but I think Joanne's knowledge, I think, can fairly be characterized as encyclopedic. Among other projects too, she's been taking the lead on our efforts to revise and amend Part 500, our cybersecurity regulation. So with that, I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Joanne, to get us started on our final panel of today. Thanks, Joanne.
Thank you, Justin, for that nice introduction. Welcome to the panel on leadership and governance in cybersecurity. I'm especially pleased to be moderating this panel today because we are joined by a terrific group of panelists who are going to provide a variety of perspectives on the topics we're going to be discussing. We have with us the Chief Information Security Officer of a bank, the General Counsel of an insurance company, and an expert cybersecurity attorney who advises companies and boards as outside counsel. The CISO is Sean Croston, Executive Vice President at BNP Paribas USA and Bank of the West, where he is responsible for several organizations servicing corporate and consumer customers. Prior to his current role, Sean was Executive VP and CISO for Santander USA. He brings a long track record of supervisory roles in the financial services and information technology worlds, having served as a supervising examiner for systemically important banks at the Federal Reserve in both Boston and New York. While there, Sean helped create and lead examinations comparing institutions and developed new information security guidance through the FFIEC. In addition, Sean has held executive roles at State Street Bank and Trust Company and JP Morgan Chase Bank. Sean began his career in the information security world, working first for PFN, a company that's focused on deep learning and the development of state-of-the-art technologies, which was acquired by Cisco, and later co-founding FirmLink Networks. We also have with us Natalie Lamarck, Senior Vice President and General Counsel of New York Life Insurance Company, who is a member of its Executive Management Committee and its Social Justice and ESG steering committees. In addition, Natalie serves as Secretary Treasury for the Board of Directors of the Life Insurance Council of New York, as a member of both the New York State Insurance Advisory Board and the Committee for the Advancement of Women in Leadership and Financial Services, and as Chair of the Audit Committee for City Year Inc., among other positions. Prior to joining New York Life, Natalie worked as an Assistant United States Attorney in the Southern District of New York and as a litigation associate at Debevoise & Plimpton. She clerked for judges in the Seventh Circuit and the Eastern District of North Carolina. And finally, we are joined by Robert Cohen, a partner at the law firm Davis Polk, where he practices in the data privacy and cybersecurity and white-collar defense and investigation groups. Rob represents companies, boards, and individuals in government and internal investigations, including SEC investigations concerning disclosures, accounting, and internal controls. Prior to joining the law firm, Rob worked for 15 years in the enforcement division at the Securities and Exchange Commission, where he was co-chief of the Market Abuse Unit and the first ever chief of their cyber unit. He is an authority on cryptocurrency enforcement, having led the SEC's first wave of cases involving digital assets and initial coin offerings, and is co-chair of the DC Bar's Securities Enforcement Subcommittee. Thank you all for taking the time to help educate us. I want to note that all of the speakers are providing their personal opinions and are not speaking on behalf of their organizations or DFS. Before we dive into the substantive portion of the panel, Maya is going to help us conduct a quick poll so we can get a sense of the roles of our audience members.
Sure, absolutely. So everyone should be able to see that in a moment. So the question is, what position do you hold within your organization? Are you part of the information security team? Are you a board member? Are you part of executive leadership? Are you an attorney? Are you with the compliance unit? Or is your role different? Is it something other than what I've shared? So everyone should be able to see that now. So Joanne, we have about 65 and counting that are answering that. So do you want to continue while we collect that feedback?
Sure. Thanks. Thanks, Maya. So as was discussed during the first morning of the symposium last month, DFS has begun the process of modernizing examinations, and we're going to be focusing on corporate governance and how leadership is incorporating cybersecurity into an organization's broader risk management functions. Given that, we're going to start with a discussion of how an organization's leadership can best manage cyber risk and integrate it into their business planning and decision making. So let's start with you, Rob. In your experience advising boards, have you found that managing cyber risk is different than managing other types of business-related risks?
Well, thanks, Joanne, and thanks to you and Justin for the invitation to be here. Such a great symposium. I think managing cyber risk for boards is somewhat different. I think it's an area that has developed quite a lot in a fairly short period of time, all for the positive. I think one common theme you'll hear from the panel today, certainly for me, is about communication. And I think one thing that makes it different is language. You know, the language around cybersecurity risks is, in some sense, its own language. You know, as we'll talk about, it doesn't mean board members or even all of executive management need to be cybersecurity experts. I think they really can't be. And it doesn't mean they have to know, you know, the latest hacking group and the latest, you know, ransomware, you know, that's going around. But they do have to have a certain familiarity with the substance in able to assess risk. I mean, first you have to communicate it to be able to manage it and govern. I think the other way it's different is if you think about sort of the traditional areas of board governance in terms of a business, you know, board members may not be experienced in the particular industry for which they're on the board. I mean, oftentimes they are, but even if they're not, the sort of common language of managing a business is likely to be very familiar to them. You know, what is generating revenue? What are the products? What are the services? What's happening with our largest customers? What are regulatory trends? What are macroeconomic trends? What legal proceedings do we have pending? How are our costs doing? What's driving costs if they're going up? You know, those are the types of issues that pretty much any business, large or small, public or private, financial or not, is going to be very important for the board to understand and to manage and to get reports. You know, cybersecurity is different, and we'll talk about expertise on the board, but boards may not have the type of expertise in managing cybersecurity risk that they do in managing, you know, P&L and revenue and costs and macroeconomic trends. So I do think it's different. It's a different language. It's a different set of information. And I do think it's changed quite a lot in recent years, that boards have really, I think, almost uniformly recognized the critical nature of managing cybersecurity risk and understanding the language and establishing a mechanism for them to get briefed regularly and be able to fulfill their responsibility.
Thank you. Those were all great points. And Natalie, I was going to ask if you, from your vantage point as an executive general counsel, have you found managing cyber risk to be fundamentally different from managing other business risks?
I think a lot of what, hopefully you guys can hear me perfect, there we go. I think a lot of what Rob said, I 100% agree with. I think you can bucket it in a lot of ways. It's similar in that you really need a structure of governance and transparency around it, which you need around any significant issues, right, that you're dealing with from a board perspective. You need collaboration, you need vigilance, and you need the CEO, quite frankly, to set the tone at the top, that this is important, that this is a priority for the organization. And, like many of the business issues that boards face, it's table stakes, right? Getting it right is critical to the success of the underlying organization. But like Rob said, there are some key differences. And I would say that one difference is just the degree of iteration that's necessary to continuously learn about and understand the landscape is a bit different. Both from the perspective of the security side of the house, as well as the perspective from the technology side of the house. And to underscore a point Rob made was, it requires everyone around the table to just keep learning. And it does require a different type of baseline knowledge. And I couldn't agree more on this last point, Rob, is the level of translation that has to occur between the technologists and the subject matter experts so that the information is digestible, understandable to non-technologists. I think that is, quite frankly, the key to any successful governance structure around cyber. It's having the experts, own their role. As the attorney in the room, that is not my role. My role is to make sure that the way in which the experts explain the issues is digestible, understandable, so that the board can engage, so that they can ask the questions, so that they can play that oversight role. If the information is left too technical, it creates a barrier between the individual and the information.
Thank you. I'm actually going to follow up with that point and this point about education with Sean. And can you tell us how you think CISOs can make cybersecurity risk digestible for leadership and help them understand the technical aspects?
Yeah, well, by the way, thank you very much for having me as well. I do appreciate it. Natalie and Rob's very nice to meet you. So it's a great question. First of all, you have to know your audience. So you have to know your board members, right? You have to understand what their profile is, what their background is, in order to orientate yourself and what messaging you're giving them. So my recommendation for CISOs is meet your board members. Meet them outside of an actual board setting. If you can schedule one-on-ones with them or group sessions, get an understanding of who they are, and then convey to them your aspiration or goal is to orientate yourself so you can explain to them what these risks are, and then open yourself up to explain technology, process, people, whatever the case is. What that bridge between the board and the CISO is more critical now than it's ever been. So the board members feel like they have a direct line of communication to the CISO is important. Once you understand the board member and what their background is, speak in their language. So for instance, for me, a lot of our board members, as Robert pointed out appropriately, is, oftentimes they're more business-centric folks. So what I try to explain is cybersecurity risk or information security risk is actually a business risk. If you're a small business owner and you didn't care about putting locks on your shop or having cameras to monitor your store, well, people would look at you sort of sideways and say, that's a bit silly, right? So if you're running a business, you have to have security. And basic tenets like that and principles like that help click in their head. Okay, well, tell me about how I'm protecting the door and not letting people in. And then that opens the aperture to start communicating in a way that most CISOs speak with. It's either through NIST or whatever regulatory body that your industry is governed by. For me, living in the financial industry, FFIC is the primary regulatory language. So then I try to introduce, this is how all financial institutions speak, this is how all our regulators speak, and then explain that language to them and give them a sense of education. So that's just a snippet, but the CISO, it's the CISO's job now. It's, if you would say 10, 15 years ago, Most CISOs were technical. Most CISOs were, you could profile them a little bit differently. I would be thrilled to understand what Natalie and Rob think about the profile of a CISO now. For me, you have to be a risk manager. You have to be a technology manager. You have to be a people manager. I mean, you can manage a shop of 15 or 1,500 people now as a CISO. You have to be a communicator, and a number of other things in order to be a CISO. So the role, I think, is, by the way, you have to understand legal and regulatory. If you don't understand legal and regulatory as a CISO, need not apply for financial services jobs. So one of the critical aspects is that communication element, especially with the board. Otherwise, you won't get the support. And more importantly, you won't enable them to do their job appropriately, which is your job. Make sure the board is aware so they can do their job appropriately.
I think I paid Sean to say that, by the way. On the regulatory and legal point, I definitely paid Sean to say that.
Yeah. PayPal, Natalie, by the way. So.
So, well, Natalie, do you have?
And before you move to the next question for the panelists, let me tell you a little bit about our audience today. So 11% said they were in information security. 1% said they are board members. 6% said that they are in executive roles. We have 12% that are attorneys. We have 7% that are in compliance. And we have 23% that are in other areas.
Wow, that's a very good cross section. Thank you. I appreciate that. So Natalie, I was going to go to you and then to Rob next, or whoever wants to answer first, but if whether or not you have any advice for reporting to the board on cybersecurity from your perspective.
I mean, I think, you really, Sean hit most of it. I'll add a couple of pieces. And, to be fair, this is the exact same advice that's given to lawyers, right? A lot of what we're saying here applies to what I would call any subject matter expert when they present to this kind of a body, where the point is accessibility and understanding and not necessarily granularity and detail. But overarching, I would just add a couple of points, is that the role now is you must be anticipatory. So it's not just about telling the board what the current landscape is, what the current needs are, but it's about helping them see how they can support the company's strategic vision down the line. And that can be challenging because the landscape is shifting. So you can't be definitive, but you have to be anticipatory, and that's an expectation. I think the other piece, and this is, I think a highlight for lawyers too, is start with the conclusion. So sometimes, there's anxiety about security issues, anxiety about cyber. You got to start with the headline. Hey, here's where we are from a benchmarking perspective. We're doing okay. We could be doing better. Here's where we're going to lean in. So don't bury the lead, because I think that's a piece of quite a bit of anxiety, I would say, for all board members. Articulate your perspective, the needs for security, where you want the company to focus from the perspective of the business model. I love the way Sean created that clear model of like locks on a door. Being able to do that to really connect the security issue, however complex, and they can be incredibly complex, to the business need, to the product, to the customer. Just draw the line for the board members as you're discussing the very complicated at times systems that you have to explain. And I think the last piece I would say is be honest, right? Don't hide the warts. Tell upfront what you are concerned about. The CISO who shows up and says everything's great and perfect will be looked at askant, because everyone knows how complex the cybersecurity landscape is. And so you have to be like incredibly transparent and open and honest, because everyone knows you cannot get an A++ in cyber. It's impossible. So you got to lead with what you see as the warts and what the plan is to address them.
Yep. And it's true, in cybersecurity, it's constantly evolving. The threats are evolving, the controls are evolving. So I think that's a great point. And Rob, I wanted to ask, in your experience, are there, topics that the directors just must be briefed on and educated on with respect to cyber.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will start by agreeing with Natalie's, initial points about accessibility and anticipation of issues. And so with that in mind, I think good communications come with experience. It's not something that happens overnight. Some CISOs may have great experience reporting to a board, but many of them probably do not. And some board members may not have experience receiving that type of information. So it really comes with experience, and having a line of communication that's open and used, as Natalie said, before there's necessarily a problem. You don't want to be communicating about something for the first time when you're in the middle of a crisis. You want to be talking about it in advance. So, the types of information I advise people on about, educating a board before there's a problem is, if you think about, and in my line of work, what I often think about is, what's a regulator going to ask after the fact if there's a problem? And so if you sort of put it in that framework a little bit, what would you expect a board to know in general? So I start with, what are the key information assets that the company needs to protect, right? All companies face some amount of cybersecurity risk, but it can really be different. They can have different vulnerabilities, different assets that need to be protected. For a financial, organization such as, DFS registrants, customer information and information about customers' finances and social security numbers and account numbers, obviously that's going to be critical. Other types of organizations, may have, intellectual property or other really business-centric information that's critical. Other organizations may be part of, what you would call either national or other infrastructure. And again, the financial firms that DFS regulates could really be considered part of that. If you're part of the banking network, it's not just your own information as an organization, it's the role you play in the broader infrastructure. So I start with, do directors know what it is they need to be prioritizing in terms of protecting? Because it's not the same for every company. And then second, where is that information? I don't think they need to have, a schematic memorized, but does the company, exclusively or partially rely on cloud providers? Or how much is preserved on site? And, something that I've seen happen that people only learn about during an incident is that, sensitive information is stored in multiple places because different, end user interfaces communicate with different types of databases. So the same type of data, a director may think of that data, we have one set of data, but, and this is often not ideal, it might be in 3 different places because 3 different systems need to access it, and they each access different types of formats. So what is it that the company needs to protect? Where is it? Who's responsible for it, right? Obviously, if you're getting a report from a CISO, the CISO has responsibility, the CIO has responsibility, but at a slightly more granular level, who's responsible for protecting it? As a general matter, what does the company do to protect it? Again, they don't need to know, the latest cybersecurity defenses, but as a general matter, what are their lines of defenses? And then the last point is, what is in place that will alert people to a problem, right? So how will people, that's one of the sort of legends of cybersecurity. It's you've either been hacked or you have been hacked and you don't know it yet. So how do you protect against being the party who's been hacked long ago and you didn't know it? So I think if you start at that basic level and as Natalie said, of communications before there's a problem, what are we protecting? Where is it? How do we do it? Who's responsible for it? And how are we going to know if there's a problem? If a board is relatively familiar at an appropriate level for a board with those issues, they should be well positioned, if a crisis does emerge.
Thank you. That's great. And I wanted to get everyone's thoughts on whether or not regulators should require cybersecurity expertise on a board. So the SEC recently proposed new rules, and one of them is about identifying board members who are cybersecurity experts. So I don't think they were proposing requiring it, but they wanted people to explain it so that shareholders could understand whether or not there were experts who understood the risks of cyber. So thoughts on that?
So I'm happy to start. I think the general response to the proposed rules that, that I've heard in the conversations I've had within the firm and within clients is that, the requirement seems awfully specific. And, there's any number of areas of expertise where you could say it would be ideal to have a board member who is a deep, deep expertise in that topic. And cybersecurity certainly is an important topic, but there may be many others. And the exact composition of a board in terms of background, I mean, that's something that, there's really important policy interests in terms of diversified boards in many different contexts. But in terms of requiring a very specific background, I think that, the sense has been that that's a little too specific. And I say it's a requirement. You're absolutely right, Joanne. The rule is proposed as a disclosure rule. That's obviously the SEC's jurisdiction. They're a disclosure agency. They're not necessarily requiring certain board membership. They're requiring disclosure. But I don't think there's any mystery to the fact that the reason for disclosure is to pressure boards into having the composition that at least the current SEC thinks is ideal. And I do think people have, reacted a bit negatively to that. When you think about, the rule proposal talks about having board members with a certification or degree in cybersecurity as one of the relevant factors in deciding if a board member has expertise. I mean, that's awfully experienced, and to use up a seat on a board for somebody who has that type of background, I think the general sense has been, as important as the area is, that's kind of specific.
Yeah, and what about, Natalie, do you think there should be cybersecurity committees or subcommittees?
I think, really along the same lines, I think being prescriptive, especially in the cyberspace, I think can be short-sighted, because oftentimes the prescriptions are chasing the situation and are lagging behind the current situation. So when I think of how you approach governance, or how you approach risk, or how you approach committees, I think you map them to the risks articulated by the organization and the business need. And when I think about, should there be a cyber committee? Should there be like these kind of specific boxes? I really always think about the innovation conversation. Remember, like when the innovation conversation first happened across corporate America, was like, there needs to be a chief innovation officer, there needs to be an innovation committee. And, along the way, we sort of realized, yes, you need expertise in that space, but it also should be the responsibility of the organization as a whole. So I think the degree to which you sort of cabin these issues too much, I think you could have a negative effect, meaning you start to remove the responsibility from the larger groups and the larger bodies. So I think while a committee should definitely be tasked, because I think all the organization's risks should be mapped to a specific committee, and the committees will report up to the larger full board as part of that governance structure. I don't think you need a subcommittee on cyber alone. I think that it should be integrated in whatever the main committee you have that deals with those specific risks, so that they can have a full view. But again, I just think being overly prescriptive is chasing a problem that, quite frankly, is it's changing, and it's too dynamic to create such a narrow focus on it in that manner.
And Sean, from a CISO perspective, do you agree or disagree?
I'm going to tread a bit lightly in this conversation. So it's not for the lack of courage. It's the lack of wanting to get fired. So no, I'm kidding. But I would agree with, look, being a former regulator, I was always very sensitive about being prescriptive. And having worked with regulators from Hong Kong Monetary Authority to Singapore Monetary Authority to you name it, I saw the varying degrees of how folks were prescriptive and not prescriptive. I think the U.S. has it right. I think the U.S. has guidance. I think they can influence via guidance, but they're not very prescriptive. In this case, I think we should remain consistent in that area. And to the points that were made, and we have a risk committee, which I report up to. We do have sessions where we do have subcommittee for cybersecurity. I've seen that in shops, right? But, for instance, if I'm on the risk committee, I know what liquidity risk is. I know what capital markets are. I know what retail banking is. I know what commercial banking is. So it's not that this is so specific that the board members aren't capable to expand their knowledge. And I've seen board members become very astute in a reasonable period of time on these topics with the right, self-motivate, spoken goodly, self-motivate, I can't say it, they're motivated by themselves, right? So, and educational outreach for both CISOs and externally. So for me, I think it's a matter of the effectiveness of the board and who's on that board and their willingness to dive in and really sink their teeth into what I believe is their responsibility. So that's sort of where I sit with it. I'd say less prescriptive is probably better.
Got it. Well, thank you. I'm going to stay with you, Sean, and I want to ask what factors CISOs should consider when deciding whether or not, if there's a cyber incident, whether or not to raise it to either the C-suite or the board.
Yeah, so most institutions have a rating scale. So P1, or they'll say P1, P2, P3, P4. That's a generic term. A P1 has an actual criteria. It has a financial impact, has an operational impact, et cetera, reputational impact, and then down to a P4. And financial institutions should be really good about defining what those levels are, what not only their incident response looks like, but it also is part of their communication process. So if you hit a P4 and it's something that is low level, do you need to involve the board? No, you don't need to involve the board. If you hit I'm making this up, by the way, if you hit a P3, maybe you need a silver committee, which is basically my level, right? It's an executive level, but it's not the executive management committee. If you hit a P2, further and further up. More transparency is good, but if you inundate people with too much noise, they can't determine what is real and is something that is just operationally, it happens, right? So you have to have the criteria, it has to be well defined, it has to be well communicated, it has to be vetted through governance. Everybody understands it, everybody agrees, and then you operate consistently against that policy that you put in place. That's my thought on it. Now, will we communicate directly to the CEO sometimes if we think maybe it's a P3 and we think it might be looking or trending towards something greater? Yes, you'll reach out and say, hey, it didn't hit the threshold, but it may. We want to make sure you've got sort of line of sight before it gets there.
All right, thank you. And then Natalie, if from an executive perspective, when do you decide that it's worth it to tell the board about a cyber incident?
I think that a lot of what Sean articulated, right, this having set guidelines and governance around the process is critical because there is so much noise and you don't want to ring alarm bells unless it is necessary. I'd say, I am really interested to hear John's perspective on this, but essentially it's, the no surprise rule for the board applies across the organization, right, for all issues. And I think a lot of the onus on us is, as senior leaders, we collaborate with one another, have a conversation about what is the significance of the incident, what kind of effect does it have on your business, on your system, potentially on your reputation, on regulatory exposure. These are similar conversations you would have about other issues in terms of determining their significance and whether they need to be reported up to the board. I think we all often also answer this question in the context of the incident, right? Capital I, like the big incident. But just because something doesn't rise to the level of, off-cycle reporting to the board doesn't mean the board doesn't hear about it, right? We have reporting that we provide to them on a cyclical basis about reports, right? Incidents that occur at the organization. It's maybe not as granular where you're going through details, but you are giving them a view of the health and hygiene of the organization, even if you're not necessarily, escalating an issue in that moment because it doesn't rise to that level of significance. So you can create transparency without setting off alarm bells.
Thank you. And Rob, what do you think the board's role is or should be in incident response?
So So we may touch on tabletops. We haven't yet. I think, another common theme for me here is anytime that there's an incident and you're involved in incident response, you don't want to be doing things for the first time. So, practicing in advance with a tabletop or something like it, can be very useful. And that can really help flesh out, not all companies are the same. It can really flesh out what's the appropriate level of board involvement. By doing an exercise, you can find out, like, hey, board would have wanted to have known more or would have wanted to have known earlier. Or actually, we overwhelmed them with too much information. It wasn't helpful for them. So, I think boards should certainly be aware. I think it's unusual for a board to be involved in, minute-to-minute decision-making during incident response. Whether a chair of a board or a chair of an audit committee or of a risk committee is kept in the loop a little more frequently because of the nature of their specific responsibilities, that might make sense. But, you don't want to be spending all your time with, reporting out when you have a crisis to deal with. But again, you don't want to be experiencing that for the first time when you have a live incident. You want to have practiced that in advance and decided what's the right cadence, for your organization and your directors.
So do you think it's important for all of the board members to be involved in a tabletop exercise or all of the C-suite? And if so, what do you recommend the topics should be for tabletop exercises?
Yeah. And so, and there's very different types of tabletop exercises. There's some that are very technical, and it's really for, the CISO or the CIO's organization, and maybe executive management is sort of in the loop a little bit. And then there's others that I really consider more governance oriented, where it's not about how do you deal with a technical problem. You're just reporting out facts to management. This is what's happening. What do you do? And I think sometimes having, just a key board member, again, like an audit committee chair or a risk committee chair or chair of the board, sort of sitting in as an observer, I think that can be very helpful. I don't know that you need to have tabletops with the full board participating, because I think I wouldn't generally expect them to be involved at that granular of a level on an incident response. But again, I think that you could have members of the board, you could have the entire board, or in particular, I think you could have a key board member to sit in on one of those governance type tabletop exercises, so they can see how the company operates, they can see how an incident is handled, and then they can provide feedback about, boy, I would have liked to have known about that. We should have a process where I get a report out about that. Or this is the point where I think the full board should know, where I want to be in a position where I'm updated so that I can decide, does the full board need to know this?
Great, thank you. And speaking of cyber incidents, we're going to get to our second poll and our final poll. Maya, can you post that?
Absolutely. So we want to know a little bit about what's going on at your organization. So has your business suffered a cybersecurity attack within the past 2 years? So yes, no, it hasn't, or I don't know. So that should be up now for everyone to answer. And Joanne, I'll come back to you with the results a little bit later.
All right, great. Thank you, Maya. Now I think we're going to turn to information security leadership. So Sean, what do you think the qualities are that CISOs should look for and require of those on your InfoSec team?
For me, first of all, it's integrity in people that raise their hand and say, I don't know, or I have a problem. Right. So, and that sounds pretty obvious, but it's not all the time. Right. So when you get senior level people, you need people you can trust that they're going to give you the truth and you're going to give them the truth back. And if they don't know what they're doing, or their team's at a deficient place, or for people process technology, raise their hands. So that's the criteria I look for. The other thing I look for is we're a team member, right? We're all in the same boat. We basically, the shops I've been in, the successful shops I've seen, they're not very hierarchical. They're flat organizations. Everybody understands what their role is in the information security team, why it's important, what their goals are and objectives in meeting those goals and objectives, and what it means not to meet those goals and objectives, from from a risk standpoint, but from an overall team standpoint. And I think if you bring in leaders like that don't think too much of themselves, right? They identify with people very well. They can create that kind of atmosphere. You're going to have a multitude of positive effects. One is, I think people perform better when they feel more comfortable that their leadership listens to them, they care about them, they want to get the job done, they're focused on getting the job, and they reward that sort of effort in community. I think the knock-on effect of that is we live in an industry right now that is extreme demand for information security professionals. I mean, I won't go on about the stats. I think everyone knows it. But if you really think about where people stay and why they stay at what they stay, is because they like the people they work with. And they feel loyalty to the people they work with, and they don't want to let the people down that they work with. And I think that's one important element. Of course, there's compensation. Of course, there's mobility. Of course, there's these other things that are, very important. But that's what I look for. Obviously, you have to have the acumen. You have to be someone who's willing to take on different roles. If you think about information security from my vantage point, I need everybody who thinks in different ways. And what I mean by that is I need the real technologist who's sitting in there and all they want to do is look at data and all they want to do is code. But I also need someone who knows how to market and communicate, to run phishing campaigns and run cool kind of events for our general population. I need an entire swath of different types of thinkers and different types of people for the different roles that are information security. But my core principles come back to is high integrity, don't really think too much about yourself, want to run a flat organization and execute and get the job done based on the goals that are set by the board, the executive management team, and down. I don't know if that's too old school for you, but it's, to me, it's not much more difficult than that.
Well, it mirrored also what Natalie said about making sure that, people tell you the truth and you have integrity in that whole system. So I actually want to go back to something Natalie said, which is that the CEO sets the tone at the top. And I wanted to ask if you have any other advice or more specific advice on how organizations can foster a company culture that does place significant importance on cybersecurity.
So everyone's part of cybersecurity team. It doesn't matter if you're a teller. It doesn't matter if you're a trader. It doesn't matter who you're part of the cybersecurity team. And that messaging has to resonate from, as Natalie points out, more than appropriately from the CEO down, and his or her directs need to promote that down, because the number one distribution for malware, as we all know, is through phishing, right? And phishing. And what we do is we try to make sure our teammates are comfortable with identifying, reporting phishing emails, and they feel like they're part of the protection society, if you will. So everybody's part of information security. We, former jobs, current job, we ran the most hokey kind of competitions amongst business heads. We had a god-awful phishing trophy that I found on the internet that was like, I don't even know what it was. And every month we would run competitions between the directs of the CEO, who had the best report rate and the lowest click rate. And you would be shocked at the response for the management team that says, I want to win that trophy. But that's kind of a fun thing to do. There's all kinds of gaming. There's all kinds of other things that you can do to have your people, your colleagues feel like they're part of protecting the institution. That's what I would recommend.
So Joanne, while we're on the subject, so let me tell you and the panelists about who's experienced with cyber attacks or not. So 10% of the audience said that yes, their organization has experienced an attack. 27% said no, and 13% said I don't know.
All right, thank you. We are running out of time and we had so many more topics, but I want to turn to part 500 and the role of the regulators. So as Justin mentioned, we are planning to revise part 500 and update it based on the evolution in cybersecurity. So I'm going to start with maybe Natalie. Do you have any suggestions about what regulators can do better, or any suggestions about specific provisions in our reg or any any regulation on cybersecurity?
I would say that the ransomware guidance that was provided was a good example, I think, of the type of guidance that strikes the right balance between providing information, benchmarking information, letting the industry know, right, where this risk is, the prominence of the risk, the development of the risk, and also giving a sense in terms of, the measures, right, the preventative and protective measures that were articulated in the reg. It wasn't clearly prescriptive, but it was a good benchmarking tool to say, here's the significant prevention and preparation metrics, or at least factors that we have seen. So it was more like helpful as opposed to being incredibly prescriptive on a technology basis. Like you need to have XYZ at this, this particular application level. I think the extent to which you can give benchmarking, let the industry know where things are, and then also provide factors that are good factors to look at internally and stoke those questions and conversations internally about where are we on that? How do we stack up there? And also be open to maybe the list you have is not necessarily the current list. Maybe there are things that need to be taken off of it. Maybe there are things that need to be added to it. Creating that iterative process is critical. So, I know I have my, we talked a little bit about the 72-hour rule, right, is probably the one that gives most industry folks agita, right, in terms of timing. But, I really do think the ransomware guidance was incredibly helpful and insightful.
Thank you. Thank you. And Rob, you're going to have the last word here. As a former regulator, any suggestions?
Well, as a former regulator, I know how much I enjoy having people in the defense bar tell me what our regulations should be. So I'm going to be thoughtful about that. We've already heard a lot about not being prescriptive. I'll just endorse that. I don't need to repeat it, but I think that's really important. And I guess what I would add is not just what the rules are, but obviously the application of the rules. And something I used to hear a lot when I was at the SEC, and I thought I understood it. I think I did understand it, but I really understand it now, is that, the entities we're talking about, the financial firms that DFS regulates, when it comes to cybersecurity, they are victims, right? Like they have a responsibility, they are entrusted with, customer information, and they have responsibilities to fulfill, no doubt about it. But when it comes to cybersecurity incidents, they are purely a victim. And when it comes to, and again, I'm not talking specifically about DFS, it could be, any regulator. When it comes to examinations or questions that follow up a report or, an investigation following an incident, I think it very quickly becomes reality for the entity that it's not being treated like a victim. It may be a victim, but it's being treated like the bad guy, because the bad guy is often untouchable. So I don't have any particular, other than the prescriptive point, I don't have any particular, asks for, the review of the regulation. My ask is more in the nature of when it comes to application, be it exam or enforcement or something else, to just have that perspective in mind.
All right. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists for all of your insight and for your time. We really appreciate it. And our time is up. So on behalf of the Cyber Division at DFS, we want to thank you all for joining us. And just one more plug, day 3 is coming up in May, and it's going to focus on small businesses. We're partnering with the Global Cyber Alliance to bring it to you. They're going to teach you about some free cybersecurity resources that we've worked with them on. And we're going to talk about a lot of risks that small businesses face. And finally, we'll have a mini tabletop where we'll run through some of the scenarios faced by small businesses. Thank you so much again, and take care, everyone. Bye.
Joanne, thank you.